They say life can change in a day, but mine flipped in a single breath, the moment my boss slid a termination letter across the conference table like he was dealing a winning poker hand. "Effective immediately," he said, smiling with the kind of smugness people only wear when they think the world is permanently tilted in their favor. I walked out of that room at 9:03 a.m. with a cardboard box, a buzzing mix of humiliation and rage, and, though none of them knew it, an ace they had handed me years earlier. By 3 p.m., the same executives who'd watched me get escorted out were staring at documents proving I now legally owned the company they'd built their whole identities on. My morning started like any other, except for the knot in my stomach, a gut feeling telling me something was off. The HR director avoided eye contact, the CFO kept whispering into his phone, and my badge suddenly stopped opening the side entrance. By the time I reached the conference room, I knew. They lined up on the far side of the table like a firing squad, pretending this was nothing personal. My direct manager, Carl, folded his hands dramatically. He'd always hated that I knew more about the operational backbone than he did. He loved credit, I loved accuracy. That made us incompatible. Carl read from the document with too much pleasure. "We appreciate your service, but we're moving in a new direction." Translation: "You made me look stupid one too many times, so we're done here." I didn't argue. They expected me to beg, panic, threaten, crack. Instead, I nodded, packed my desk slowly, and walked out with the calm of a man watching the first domino fall. Because what Carl didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the company's patents, software infrastructure, and data architecture were all intertwined with a licensing entity I had quietly founded years earlier. A legal structure created during an early expansion phase when leadership needed something done quickly, cheaply, and with minimal oversight. I did them a favor. They signed the paperwork without a second glance. And unknowingly, they signed over operational dependency on me. For years, that licensing entity sat dormant, receiving monthly compliance documents, storing renewal paperwork, and getting digital pings whenever key systems were deployed. Nothing shady. Nothing hidden. Entirely legal and meticulously structured. But today, on the day they decided I was disposable, it became a loaded weapon. By noon, after a brief visit to my lawyer, who was much too excited by the situation, I initiated a formal notice of license reassignment. Not termination, reassignment. Meaning the company still had full use of every tool, every system, every line of code, but only with the approval of the new license owner. Me. At 2:15 p.m., as they were preparing an internal email celebrating their strategic restructuring, their entire operations dashboard populated with a red banner, "License owner change pending, administrative review required." By 2:45 p.m., the CTO barged into Carl's office holding printouts, sweating through his shirt. "Who approved this?" he demanded, voice breaking under the weight of panic. Carl stuttered something about HR, about me no longer being an employee, about locking him out immediately. That's when legal entered, pale as printer paper, clutching the signed documents from 5 years ago. "This is binding," the attorney whispered. "He controls operational continuity. We can't deploy, update, or modify anything without his sign-off." Carl's face drained of color. He looked like he was about to faint. "Then get him back," he croaked. Too late. At exactly 3 p.m., they called me into an emergency meeting, not as an employee, not as someone begging for their job, but as the sole controlling owner of the company's core operational license. I walked into the room, the same one where they'd fired me hours earlier. Only this time, they stood up when I entered. Funny how power shifts. Carl tried to open the conversation with forced friendliness. "We seem to have a misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," I said. "You terminated my employment, but you didn't terminate my ownership." Silence. Delicious, terrified silence. The CFO cleared his throat. "What do you want?" I said slowly, savoring each word, "what I was denied this morning. Control. Autonomy. And a fair valuation. Because here's the kicker, I didn't want my old job back. I didn't want a promotion. I didn't want revenge in the petty sense. I wanted the company. And thanks to my lawyer's brilliant restructuring plan and their sloppy signatures 5 years ago, ownership, real, legal, enforceable control, was now within reach. The board had no choice but to negotiate. By the end of the meeting, the papers were signed. A buyout. A transfer. A new operational hierarchy. I left the building at 3 p.m. not as someone who had been fired, but as someone who now owned the beating heart of the company that had tried to discard him. Funny how quickly fortunes flip when you understand the systems better than the people who rely on them. The following days felt like watching a storm roll in while sitting comfortably indoors with a warm cup of coffee. I didn't lift a finger, didn't have to. The consequences of their arrogance began unfolding on their own, and all I had to do was answer the phone when my attorney told me which signatures were needed next. By Monday morning, word had reached the full board. Most of them had only skimmed past the operational dependency contract years ago, trusting Carl and the CTO to handle the technical stuff. Now those same board members were staring at a catastrophic truth: the company couldn't legally operate, expand, integrate, or onboard new clients without my approval. Every system, from payroll to logistics, was built on the architecture I designed. And the person who owned it was no longer on their payroll. Board members began calling me privately, one by one. Not angrily, politely, even respectfully. Some sounded desperate. Others tried to sweet talk. A few offered roles dripping with fake authority. The funniest part? None of them wanted Carl anywhere near the negotiations. I enjoyed each call for what it was: recognition they owed me, finally delivered. Meanwhile, inside the company, panic was boiling over. Deployments were stalled. Client updates couldn't go live. Investors started asking uncomfortable questions. Carl kept insisting he had things under control, which only made him look more incompetent with every passing hour. The CTO quietly began packing his office. HR refused to answer emails. By Wednesday afternoon, I received a message I wasn't expecting. A simple text from the board chair: "We'd like to meet." Not at the office, at a private conference suite across town. Neutral turf. I walked in wearing jeans and a blazer, not the usual corporate costume. They were already seated, stiff and exhausted, looking like they'd aged months in a week. Carl wasn't present. On purpose. The chair cleared his throat. "Thank you for coming. We'd like to discuss a long-term resolution." I sat. Calm. Confident. In control. So would I. They talked first: apologies, explanations, excuses, promises. It was corporate groveling painted with professional polish. When they finally stopped, every eye turned to me. And that's when I said the magic words: "I'm not looking to come back as an employee." Their shoulders sagged with relief, premature relief. "But I am willing," I continued, "to take full ownership of the operations subsidiary. Fairly valued, of course. And with complete autonomy." The chair blinked. "You want to acquire it?" "Already halfway there," I said, setting a folder on the table. "You just need to sign." Because while they were unraveling, I had already struck deals with partners, secured funding, prepared filings, and locked down key intellectual property. They thought firing me removed leverage. It actually activated it. The board didn't debate long. They needed stability. They needed operations back online. And most of all, They needed this nightmare to end before shareholders demanded heads. Within hours, the deal was finalized. I walked out owning the entire structure that made their company function: servers, software, licenses, infrastructure, contracts. They kept their brand name and their building. I kept everything that made the brand possible. Carl was removed a week later. The CTO resigned. HR underwent leadership transition. The company had to rebuild almost its entire internal backbone from scratch. I didn't ruin them. They did that themselves. I simply stopped saving them. And, in the end, the message was clear: if you treat people like they're disposable, don't be surprised when they stop holding your company together. At 9 a.m., they fired me. At 3 p.m., I owned their future. The irony, of course, is that once the deal was inked and the dust settled, they realized something they should have known all along: I had never wanted to destroy them. If that had been my intention, I could have flipped a switch and turned their entire enterprise dark in seconds. But power isn't about destruction, it's about direction. And I directed mine toward building something better. My first act as the new owner of the operations subsidiary was simple. I called the small team of people who had worked with me over the years and actually respected the work. These were the quiet geniuses, the late-night problem solvers, the people Carl always ignored because they didn't brag loudly enough. Every one of them answered the phone. Every one of them said yes to joining me. We built a company that didn't require fear to function. Clients followed us immediately, some subtly, some openly. They'd worked with me for years and trusted the systems I created. They wanted continuity, not a restructured mess run by people who barely understood how their own products worked. Within months, our contract list doubled. A year later, it doubled again. Meanwhile, my former employer limped along. They were too proud to admit they'd hollowed out their own infrastructure. Too busy managing fallout to innovate. Too stuck in old hierarchies to adapt. They became the kind of company they once mocked: slow, bureaucratic, reactive instead of proactive. Word eventually spread about why operations had suddenly been sold off. About how firing the person who designed everything had been their fatal mistake. About how legally binding paperwork had quietly reshaped the power dynamic of an entire organization. And eventually, inevitably, people started rewriting the history. Some said the firing was personal. Some said it was political. Some whispered it was a setup from the start. Some claimed they always knew I was the backbone of the tech. None of that mattered. Because here's the truth most companies never understand until it's too late: you can replace titles. You can replace managers. You can replace buzzwords, slogans, and empty leadership speeches. But you cannot replace the person who actually knows how everything works. I became a quiet legend in certain corporate circles, not by bragging, not by burning bridges, but simply by letting the consequences of their arrogance speak for themselves. Recruiters told the story. Legal departments warned about it. Executives whispered it like a cautionary tale: don't fire the architect. And Carl? Last I heard, he'd taken a job at a smaller firm miles outside the city. Word is he doesn't have much authority there. Too many people know the story. Sometimes I think back to that morning, 9 a.m., the humiliation, the sideways smirks, the feeling of being thrown away. And then I remember walking out at 3 p.m. with a pen in my hand, a smile on my face, and a company in my pocket. They fired me thinking they'd taken everything from me. But all they really did was set me free to take everything that mattered. Success has a strange way of making the past feel small. Not irrelevant, just distant. Like a bad song you once knew every word to, now fading under the volume of a much better life. But the full circle moment, the one that truly sealed everything, came a year and a half after they fired me. It was at an industry summit, a massive annual event packed with executives, tech leaders, investors, and the same decision-makers who once wouldn't return my emails. My company, my actual company, had been invited to present a keynote on operational resilience. Funny, considering the only reason I ever built a resilient system was because I'd learned the hard way that you can't trust incompetent leadership to protect anything. I arrived backstage to check the setup, and that's when I saw him. Carl. He looked smaller, older. His posture was different, less inflated, more cautious. He was standing with a badge from a logistics firm I'd never heard of, the kind of company that rents office space above laundromats. Temporary, forgettable. I realized he was waiting in line to speak on a side panel, one of the tiny sessions squeezed between lunch and coffee breaks. A graveyard slot. He recognized me before I even said a word. His eyes darted to the event banner with my company's name on it. To the large mainstage auditorium behind me. To the staff sorting microphones. To the crowd forming outside. Then his face shifted into something I'd never seen on him before. Not anger. Not arrogance. Not fake politeness. Shame. He forced a smile and stepped closer. "Hey," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Long time no see." "Sure is," I replied. He swallowed. "Heard your business is doing well." "Very well," I said. No embellishment. No gloating. Just truth. He nodded slowly, eyes darting to the floor. "Listen, about what happened, things were complicated back then." "They were simple," I corrected. "You wanted me gone. You got your wish." He flinched, just barely. I wasn't cruel. But I also wasn't going to pretend he hadn't built his empire on insecurity and shortcuts. "I'm glad it worked out for you," he muttered. "It worked out because you fired me," I said. "Best decision you ever made for me." He gave a defeated chuckle. "Yeah. I guess so." A staff member called my name. It was time to head to the stage. Before I walked away, Carl said, almost in a whisper, "I didn't know what you were capable of." I stopped and met his eyes. "That was the problem," I said. "You never bothered to look." And then I walked onto a stage he could never reach, in front of an audience he could never fill, representing a company he could never have built. Applause echoed through the auditorium as I stepped forward, not as someone who'd been fired, dismissed, or underestimated, but as someone who had rewritten the rules. The standing ovation wasn't revenge. The success wasn't revenge. Owning the company that once owned me wasn't even revenge. The real revenge was this: they fired me thinking they'd ended my story. But all they did was free me to write a better one. And that's the part no one at my old job ever understood. Revenge isn't slamming a door on your way out. It's becoming someone they can no longer reach. When the keynote ended, people lined up to talk: investors, founders, department heads from companies that once felt galaxies away. As I stepped off the stage, shaking hands and answering questions, I glanced toward the hallway where Carl had been standing. He was gone. Not surprising. There's nothing harder than watching someone you underestimated succeed without you. But I wasn't thinking about him anymore. I wasn't thinking about the humiliation of getting fired at 9 a.m., or the panic that followed, or the uncertainty that used to keep me awake at night. All I could think was how strangely perfect the journey had been, how necessary the fall was for the rise that followed. I walked out of the auditorium into the sunlight, the applause still fading behind me, and for the first time in years, the story finally felt complete. I hadn't just survived what they did to me. I built something so strong, so undeniable, that nothing they could have done would matter anymore. And that's the quiet, satisfying truth about real revenge: you don't go back to prove them wrong. You move forward until their opinion no longer counts. As I stepped outside, the cold air hit my face, sharp and refreshing. For a moment, I just stood there, letting the reality settle in. 6 hours. That's all it had taken. 6 hours to go from terminated employee to majority shareholder of the company that once treated me like a disposable asset. People walked past me without a clue that the balance of power in our little corporate universe had quietly flipped. No victory parade, no cinematic music, no dramatic confrontation in the boardroom. Justice didn't come wrapped in theatrics, it came in silence, with signatures, stock transfers, and one overlooked clause in a dusty contract Carl had never bothered to read. Funny how arrogance blinds people. My phone buzzed, messages from the board, from old colleagues, from executives suddenly eager to catch up. I let it ring. It wasn't their turn to talk. Not anymore. I thought back to that morning, the HR room, the patronizing smiles, Carl's smug little speech about restructuring and efficiency, his hand on my shoulder as if he were doing me a kindness. He had no idea he was shaking hands with his future boss. At 9 a.m., they dismissed me as irrelevant. At 3 p.m., they were drafting a press release calling me a visionary leader returning to guide the company's next phase. The poetry of corporate karma writes itself. Standing on the curb, watching the traffic flow by, I realized something I hadn't admitted before. I wasn't angry anymore. Not even a little. You can't be angry at people who are no longer tall enough to cast a shadow over you. Revenge wasn't the point. Reclaiming my power was. And now that I had it, I didn't feel the urge to wield it like a weapon. I felt the urge to build better, smarter, kinder. To create the kind of workplace I should have had from the start. One where talent mattered more than egos, where ideas mattered more than titles, and where employees weren't thrown away like broken office furniture. I took one last look at the building, gleaming windows, polished steel, a monument to ambition and hypocrisy, and I almost laughed. "I'll take it from here," I whispered. Then I turned away, hands in my pockets, walking toward a future that, for once, belonged entirely to me. Real revenge isn't destruction. Real revenge is ownership of the company, of your story, of your future. And I didn't just win.